Christian Heroes Then and Now. David Livingstone. Africa's Trailblazer by Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 8. A Second Trip North. The wagon rumbled northward. Every hour, David Livingstone would pull out his compass and take a reading. In a notebook, he would record the exact direction they were headed and jot down a careful description of the land they were traveling through. 4 days after leaving the village of Mabatsa, the group arrived at a village belonging to the Bakwains, a subtribe of the Bechuana people. Again, the travelers were welcomed into the village, where the people poked and prodded at their belongings. Most of them had never seen a white person before, and they insisted David roll up his shirt sleeves so they could examine his skin more closely. They spat on his freckled forearms and rubbed vigorously, then laughed with surprise when his freckles would not rub off. They also peered at the 2 white missionaries' long, bumpy noses, pinching them to make sure they were firmly attached to their faces. Long noses, the children giggled as they danced around the men with glee. Once again, the missionaries were offered a hut to sleep in by the chief, but this time David was ready. He explained that he was a doctor and needed to use his own tent to make medicine. Once the word was out that he could cure people, he was pressed to examine all manner of ailments, from sore eyes to infected feet. The visit with the Bakwains was a great success, and David began wondering why it was so hard to make friends with the tribes around the mission at Kuruman. One night, as he and Roger Edwards lay in their tent, he asked about this. Why is it that the people here are so much more friendly to missionaries? David heard Roger Edwards clear his throat. I think there are a lot of reasons, but probably the main one is the whole problem of marriage. The way to show you are an important man in Africa is to have many wives. If you can support many wives and all the children they produce, it shows that you have a lot of wealth. That makes sense, said David. Well, yes, it does, but it's not God's way. The Bible teaches that each man must have only one wife, and that's where the problem begins. When a native man becomes a Christian, he has to give up all but one of his wives. The natives don't want to do this, and they end up despising missionaries and the gospel message. How do we get around that? Asked David. I don't see that we do, said Roger, rolling over on his cot. It's a matter of getting to the children young, before they marry. I think once they have more than one wife, it's very difficult to get them to budge. He yawned loudly. Well, I'm sleepy. How about you? Yes, me too, replied David, although his mind was already racing. He lay on his back on his cot for a long time, thinking about the whole problem of converting Africans. He could see what a problem having many wives could be, but there had to be some way to reach the African men. There had to be some way around the problem, though right then he couldn't think what it might be. The 2 missionaries stayed in the village for a week, and David made many friends as he treated their endless ailments and illnesses. When he announced that it was time for him to return to Kuruman, the people of the village were upset. "What have we done wrong to send the white men away?" they asked Pomare. Then they begged, "Please tell them to stay with us until the rainy season starts." "Tell them I will be back," David instructed Pomare, "and the next time I come, I will stay longer." This seemed to cheer the people up a little, and they crowded around the wagon to say farewell to their new friends. The trip back to Kuruman was slow. David insisted on taking a different route so that he could take notes and add details to his map along the way. The villages were small and sparsely spread along this route, and it was not until they were about 150 miles from Kuruman that they came across a village of any size. It, too, was a Bakwain village, and the men stopped to introduce themselves. However, Sekle, the village chief, sent word to them that he could not entertain them properly because of his sore eyes. David was able to supply him with some ointment that began to cure his problem. Chief Sekle and the missionaries then sat down together to a meal of milk and beans. The chief was so grateful for the ointment that he presented the missionaries with a deer carcass to take along for food on the remainder of their journey. David thanked him and promised to return to visit him on his next trip north. As David and Roger Edwards left the village, they had no idea they were being followed. They had gone about 10 miles when David pulled the wagon to a halt and they began to set up camp for the night. As they were preparing a patch of ground on which to pitch their tent, David heard an unfamiliar sound under the wagon. He stopped and listened. There it was again. It sounded almost like sobbing. When David crawled under the wagon to investigate, he found a girl who looked to be about 11 years old. The girl was naked except for many strands of colorful beads draped around her neck and body. Tears were streaming down her face. "What are you doing here?" David asked softly, and then he remembered that she wouldn't understand a word he was saying. He backed out from under the wagon and went to fetch Pomare, who was hauling water from a nearby stream. He waited patiently for Pomare to tell him why this girl had followed them out into the wilderness and why she was now crying so hard under the wagon. It didn't take long for the girl's story to come out. The girl's parents had died when she was very young, and her older sister had taken care of her since then. However, the week before, her older sister had died too, and now an uncle had decided to sell her as a wife to someone in the village. The girl did not want to be married. Instead, she wanted to stay with some friends who lived near Kuruman. When she heard that was where the missionaries were headed, she followed the wagon, waiting until she was far away from the village before showing herself. Pomare had just finished relating the girl's story when a warrior with a gun slung across his shoulder came running down the trail towards them. David looked around frantically. He guessed the warrior had come to retrieve the girl, but it was too late to hide her. David stepped in front of the girl and waited. As soon as he got close, the warrior started yelling in Bantu. He had come for the girl who had been promised to his brother as a wife. David quietly prayed under his breath. He admired the girl's plucky determination, and he made it clear to Pomare that she would not be forced to return to the village. After several minutes of heated exchange between Pomare and the warrior, an agreement was worked out. If the girl returned all the beads she was wearing, which were used as money, she would be free to travel on with the missionaries. The girl quickly unwound the beads and handed them to the warrior, who seemed satisfied with the outcome of the situation as he trotted off back along the trail. For the rest of the journey, the girl traveled with the men. Sometimes she walked alongside the wagon with Pomare and the other African guide. At other times, she rode in the wagon beside David, chattering away to him in Bantu the whole time. Finally, in December 1841, the travelers arrived safely back in Kuruman. The girl was reunited with her friends, who welcomed her into their hut. Roger Edwards seemed particularly relieved to find that the Reverend Moffat hadn't returned in their absence. In fact, the Reverend had sent a letter saying that he would be staying in England even longer than planned. The printing of the New Testament in the Sequana language, the Sequana dialect, was taking longer than expected, and the London Missionary Society had been so impressed by his talks on Africa that they had asked him to write a book about the missionary work before he returned. So the Reverend Moffat was hard at work writing a book which he had decided to entitle Missionary Labors and Scenes in Southern Africa. Upon his return, David was thrown straight back into the life of the mission station at Kuruman. Since he was the only doctor for hundreds of miles, people flocked to the station for help. And while David tried his best to treat all those who came to him with medical needs, he kept reminding himself that he had not come to Africa just to stay in one place and lance boils and bandage wounds. He had come to preach the gospel message to people who had never heard it before. And so, almost as soon as he arrived back at Kuruman from his trip north, David began planning another trip. This time, though, Roger Edwards made it clear he would not go along. For him, it was just too dangerous to take such a risk again. But not for David Livingstone. Indeed, by now his fellow missionaries had figured out that David actually seemed to thrive on taking risks. On this trip, David wanted to return to visit the Bokwains, particularly Chief Sekle, as he had promised, as well as map out some more of the countryside. He chose a different route from before to take him north, and although he did end up among the Bokwains, it was not the group he had anticipated. He arrived at another village, the residents of which, although they were Bokwains, were bitter enemies of Chief Sekle and his village. This village was called Lepelol, and it was led by a chief named Bubby. When Chief Sekle was a young boy, Chief Bubby had killed his father, and from that time on, hatred had erupted between the two villages. David refused to take sides in their hostilities and instead spent his mornings treating the sick and injured, and his afternoons working alongside and talking to the people of the village. By doing this, he was able to quickly pick up the Bantu language until he was able to speak it quite fluently. He did, however, make a few embarrassing mistakes. Since Bantu is a tonal language, the same word could have several meanings depending on the tone in which it was spoken. In the course of preaching about sin, David discovered that because of his pronunciation, he was actually preaching against cow dung. Regardless, David was given much respect in the village because of his ability to heal people. Only one other man in the village was given the same level of respect, and that was the rainmaker. Because the people of the village had no way to get a lot of water from the river to their crops. Regular rain was very important to them. Hence, it was the rainmaker's job to make sure it rained regularly. Thinking back to the irrigation system at Kuruman, David decided it was time to do something about the problem, and in the process, make the rainmaker obsolete. He laid out a string about 450 feet in length from the river to the garden area. David wondered how he could dig a channel that long. He had only one spade head without a handle, and he knew the Africans used only sticks to dig with. He decided, however, to dig with what he had. He stripped off his shirt, found the spade head in the wagon, and began to dig. Soon, a crowd of curious onlookers gathered around him. After watching for a while, one man picked up a stick and joined David. Others followed his lead until over 100 people were scraping and picking at the dirt along the line of string. A system using tortoise shells and wooden bowls to scoop out the dirt and cart it away was soon developed. After several days of hard work, the channel was finally finished, and water flowed to the crops growing in the garden area. Everyone, including the village rainmaker, was pleased with the results. By the time David was ready to leave, he had become the most popular man in the village. Still, despite his popularity, he was determined to press on farther north. He said farewell to Chief Bubby, promising him they would meet again. Soon after David left Lepelo, he received word that Chief Bubby had died. The chief had asked the village witch doctor to remove an evil spell he was convinced someone had put on him. The witch doctor had decided to do this by standing Chief Bubby next to a tree he intended to blow up with gunpowder. He felt sure the blast would frighten away the evil spirits that had brought the spell to the chief. Regrettably, the chief was standing too close to the tree and was killed by the explosion. David was very discouraged when he heard what had happened. He had told Chief Bubby many times that God was the only one who was able to help him find the peace of mind he sought. Now it was too late. The chief had died a senseless death. David stretched out the map of Africa in front of him. He had filled in many details on it from his travels, but as he examined the area directly north, he had no real clue as to what might lie ahead. All the map said of this area was unexplored Kalahari Desert. David refolded it and slipped it back into his leather satchel. Everyone in the group was now walking. The wagon and all but 4 of the oxen had been left behind. The plain the men were about to cross was too sandy, and the wheels of the wagon would have become stuck in the sand almost immediately. The men had loaded their things onto the backs of the 4 oxen, which they now led. As he trudged on, David was thrilled to think that he was the first white person to see the scrubby hills and wind-swept valleys the group was walking through. Even though the men were only on the southern edge of the Kalahari Desert, getting enough water each day was soon a concern. The African guides, however, knew which plants were moist enough to squeeze water from when they could find no springs. After 2 weeks of trekking northward, the group arrived at a Bamangwato village, ruled over by Chief Sekomi. The 3,000 or so people who lived in the village gave the travelers an enthusiastic welcome. David went straight to work, treating the sick and learning as much about the villagers' culture as he could. Whenever the opportunity arose, he spoke to people about God's love for them, but it was difficult for the people to grasp the full meaning of what he said. The people had never heard of such a God before, and the very word God itself caused confusion. The Bamangwato word for God meant a very important person or being. And so the people spoke of many gods. When David cured people of their medical problems, the people even called him God. It was all very difficult, but David was determined to find some way to get the idea across to the people of the village. He knew he had succeeded to some extent. When Chief Sukomi visited him in his tent one evening, after some brief talk about what had gone on during the day, Chief Sukomi came right to the point. He looked David in the eye and said, "I have come here to ask you for something. Give me some medicine that will change my heart. I am too proud, and I always feel angry with my people. I don't want to be like that anymore." David reached for his Bible. "My friend," he said, holding it up, "the only medicine that will change your heart is found in this book, if you will." "No, no," interrupted the chief. "You don't understand. Now. I want my heart changed now. I want medicine that will change me now." Of course, David had no medicine for Chief Sukomi's condition, and after a few more minutes of demanding the impossible, the chief left. The next day, the chief did not mention his visit of the night before, but David was encouraged to think that at least Chief Sukomi knew he needed something to change his heart. Now, all David had to do was think of a way to explain exactly what it was the chief needed. David was determined to go about 20 miles farther north to visit the Baka tribe, and he told Chief Sukomi of his plans. The chief's eyes opened wide. "No," he warned, "you must not go to the Baka. They are vicious people. They will surely kill you as they killed the other white men in his group." David frowned. He had not heard about any other white people in the area. "Who were they?" he asked. "I don't know." But he was a trader traveling from the east. Chief Sukomi lowered his voice for dramatic effect before going on. "I hear they poisoned his food and water, and when all his party died, they killed his oxen and ate them." "I will have to be extra careful then. Thank you for the warning," replied David. "You would still go?" asked Chief Sukomi incredulously. "I do not understand you. You risk death for what?" "To find out who lives there and to prepare the way for the gospel message," said David firmly. "Well," said Chief Sukomi, rubbing his chin, "if you must go to the Baka, you will not go alone. I will send 4 of my warriors with you, though I fear you will all perish." David thanked the chief and returned to his tent to pack his belongings for the trip. He wondered whether the chief was right. Was it a suicide trip? Perhaps it would be safer to just turn around and head back to Kuruman. But David Livingstone had been stubborn all his life. He was the only weaver in Blantyre to become a doctor, and the only doctor in his class to become a missionary. When he made up his mind about something, he did it. And he had made up his mind. Despite the danger, he was going to find out who lay to the north, and that was all there was to it.